What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. This is going to be a Lightning Staff backbar non-pet build. So this is the one of our three primary endgame Magicka Sorcerer builds. We have the three ones that we have are going to be the Inferno Staff backbar non-pet, Lightning Staff backbar non-pet, and the pet build. So this is a non-pet build if you have a Lightning Staff backbar. If you want to use a Lightning Staff backbar. So the main differences between the Inferno and Lightning Staff backbars are really going to be in terms of our ultimate choice on our front bar as well as our race. Everything else pretty much remains exactly the same between both builds here. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over gear, CP point distribution, skill points, skill attributes, skill bars, our attribute points, our race, our Mundus, everything like that. We'll talk about our rotation, kind of what goes into our rotation, what our mentality is, kind of what skills you want to prioritize, and then finish things off with the 6 million dummy par so you guys can get an idea of what the rotation looks like, as well as what sustain will look like with this build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start off with our gear first. I am using 2-piece Zaan. Zaan is currently the strongest monster helm for Magicka DPS. However, it is tempered by the fact that you need to be within melee range. Basically, you have to be within 10 meters in order for Zaan to take effect. It's also only a single target effect, so it doesn't affect more than one enemy at a time. So it does lose out to Ilambris and as well as Skoria when it comes to AoE damage, but in terms of raw single target damage, Zaan will win out as long as you're within melee range of the boss. So if you're facing a boss that's very mobile, or you're going to be very mobile, or you're going to be standing further away than 10 meters from the boss, then obviously Zaan is not going to be the right helm for you to use. In those situations, you will want to use either Ilambris or Skoria. Skoria does a little bit better with very mobile bosses, for example in kind of against like the twins in Vima, or all the bosses in Vet Asylum. So Skoria will pretty much pull neck to neck with Ilambris in those scenarios, but otherwise Ilambris will pull ahead for more stationary bosses. For our 5-piece, we are going with Netch's Touch, mainly because we have so much shock damage. Pretty much all of our abilities are going to be shock, and we are going with a double Lightning Staff setup, at least for this particular build, so we are using Netch's Touch to take advantage of that additional spell damage to our shock abilities. Another option you can use is going to be Julianos instead if you don't want to farm for Netch's Touch. Netch's Touch, you do have to farm it, and it only comes in light, so you need to have a heavy and medium monster helm set. But Julianos is crafted, so it is easier to obtain in the correct trace that you want. Plus, because it's crafted, you can decide what weight you want it to be in, so you're not kind of stuck trying to hope for a medium or a heavy shoulder or helm when it comes to trying to get your monster helm sets together. So you can go with Netch's Touch or Julianos, so pick whichever one you want. Julianos to me is the easier option to go for, but Netch's Touch does do a little bit better with this particular build. For our jewelry, we're going with 3-piece Moondancer. I have a regen glyph with 2 spell damage glyphs. However, you can go with 3 spell damage glyph if you'd like. Sorks just generally have pretty bad sustain compared to other Magicka DPS. That's why I have that regen glyph there. Because in longer fights, you need to be able to sustain yourself. So that's why, in my opinion, going with the 1 regen and 2 spell damage is worth the very small DPS loss that you see. If you don't have Moondancer, then you can go with any of the Minor Slayer sets, Infallible, Aether, or Master Architect. Or if you don't have any of the Minor Slayer sets, then you can go with Willpower jewelry. You can purchase that off of Guild Traders. Just make sure if you're using Willpower that is the Arcane, you have the Arcane trait and not Robust and Healthy, because you do want that Max Magicka in order to help out your DPS there. For our front bar, we're going with the Asylum's Perfected Lightning Staff. You can go with a non-perfect Asylum Staff if you'd like. I have it infused with an Absorb Magicka enchant. If you are using Asylum, then you can use the Absorb Magicka enchant because Burning and Concussed is applied to the enemy through the set effect there. If you don't have an Asylum Perfect or Asylum Non-Perfect staff, then you can go with a Minor Slayer staff, whichever one matches your jewelry. Just make sure it's infused. If you don't have any of those options, then you can just go with a regular old infused lightning staff on the front bar. If you aren't using an Asylum staff, then I would recommend looking at taking either the shock damage glyph or a flame damage glyph in order to help apply Concussed and Burning onto the enemy. But you don't have to do it. You can stick with the Absorb Magical Glyph with the added regen, but it's better to use the Shock Damage Glyph if you don't have the Asylum Staff. You don't necessarily even need to use a Lightning Staff. You can go with an Inferno front bar here too. It's kind of up to you which one you want to do. Inferno Staff and Lightning, Inferno Lightning and Lightning, they pull pretty similar DPS. Inferno Lightning, in my experience, pulls a little bit lower compared to Lightning, but it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. If you manage to get a Perfected Inferno Staff before a Perfected Lightning Staff, then obviously you can use an Inferno Staff on your max work. No issues at all. And for a back bar, I'm going to an infused Maelstrom Lightning Staff with a weapon damage enchant. For our race, we are a high elf. We Ultimate are going to be the best option if you are going with the Lightning Staff back bar. However, you can use any of the other magically inclined races. Dunmer, the Dark Elf, come in as a close second, followed by the Bretons, and then you can also, kind of a dark horse, use it in Argonian as well. Argonians do have a slightly better sustain due to their potion passive. However, they don't get as much max magicka, so they ultimately don't pull as good DPS. Bretons have additional survivability through improved spell resistance, and they have some 3% cost reduction in their magicka ability, so they do have some pretty nice sustain, but they lack the elemental damage that the Dunmer and the High Elves have. For our attribute points, we do have 64 points into Magicka. You can put a couple of points into health here. We are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so we already have a health enchant on one of our large pieces, but if you feel like you need more survivability, then you can shift a couple of points from Magicka into health. I personally wouldn't put more than 4 or 5 points into health, because you don't want to sacrifice too much when it comes to damage. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Apprentice, but you can go with the Lover. It's all going to depend on your group and the kind of debuff sets that you have. If you don't have Torog's Infused Crusher and Alkosh, then ultimately Apprentice is going to end up... Apprentice will lose out to the Lover. Remember that the penetration cap is 18,200, so if the Lover, with all your debuffs up, does put you over the penetration cap, then it's going to be a DPS loss, and you're going to want to switch over to the Apprentice. So you're going to figure out with your own raid group whether the Apprentice or the Lover is the right Mundus for you to use. And we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew. Like I mentioned earlier, this gives us additional regen at the cost of lower max magicka and max health compared to blue food. By all means, you can use blue food if you'd like, just you will be losing out on the additional regen, so you expect to have your attack a little bit more often. There is gold food from Clockwork City that you can buy off of guild traders. If you want to learn it, you have to do a series of quests that starts in the Outlaw Refuge in the Brass Fortress. It is basically a slightly upgraded version of Witchmother's Potent Brew. It has a little bit more regen, health, and max magicka, and it also gives you some health regen as well. So, but it is gold food, so it is expensive to make as well as to buy because it uses perfect row. So don't feel like you have to use that food. You could, by all means, you can do perfectly fine using Witchmother's Potent Brew. Now for our skill bars. For our front bar here, we have Crystal Frags, Crushing Shock. You can go with Force Pulse. I personally stick with Crushing Shock for that interrupt. Having a ranged interrupt is pretty important in a lot of vet trials, so Crushing Shock is very important to have on at least one of your Magicka DPS in your group. Bound Aegis, Haunting Curse, Inner Light, and I have the Greater Storm Atronach here. So this is going to be our primary ultimate that we're going to be using here. You can use Shooting Star instead if you would like. The Storm Atronach pulls a little bit ahead of Shooting Star when it comes to single target DPS. In addition, you do have that Charged Lightning synergy, which lets your Atronach do more damage for 8 seconds, gives you and whoever activates the synergy Major Berserk. It is one of the only sources of Major Berserk in the game, so it's a very nice boost to your DPS because the Atronach is doing more damage as well as your ally as well. But again, you can go with Shooting Star if you'd like. For our back bar, we have Mage's Wrath, Liquid Lightning, Bound Aegis, Blockade of Storms. This is where we would put our shield, Hardened Ward or Empowered Ward. Kind of pick whichever one you'd like. Empowered Ward gives you a smaller shield for a more period of time, plus it gives you Minor Intellect, which boosts your Magicka regen. Hardened Ward will give you a larger shield for a shorter period of time, so it's a little bit better for survivability that way. I like to go with Hardened Ward over Empowered Ward, but you can really pick whichever one you want. An honorable mention does go to Harness Magicka. Harness Magicka is more expensive than your ward, and it also is a smaller shield. But it does return Magicka to you if you are hit with spell damage. So that's kind of the caveat there. In order to get your sustain from Harness Magicka, you do need to take damage, and it has to be spell damage. So you're not necessarily always going to be able to get that additional sustain. So I stick with Ward. Harness Magicka, just for me, the extra sustain isn't worth the additional cost and the smaller shield. And our ultimate here is going to be the Desperate Staff ulti, Thunderous Rage. So in terms of, we'll talk about ultimate choice later on when we talk about our rotation. For our CP points, you have 240 points across each of the 3 different constellations. So starting with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanus and 75 into Tenacity, which leaves 90 points, which you can kind of put wherever you'd like into the rest of the nodes. You can kind of put them anywhere you'd like. I personally have 31 into Shadow Ward, 20 into Tumbling, and 31 into Warlord, but again, you can kind of play around and redistribute accordingly depending on your playstyle. Now for our blue CPs, I do have a disclaimer here. This particular setup is optimized for my personal raid group, my 2 raid guilds. We only get Infused Torx Crusher. Our tanks do not use Alcast, so that's why I have so many points into Spell Erosion. In order to figure out the best CP distribution for your particular raid guild, you're going to need to get 2 add-ons. You're going to need to get Constellations as well as Combat Metrics. So basically what you want to do is you're going to want to take a parse. It can be a dummy parse, but I would recommend trying to find an in-raid parse. For example, just take a night and do Vet Ethereal Archive because those bosses are pretty much tank and spanks. So pretty much take your Storm Atronach or your Mage parse, save it. You open up Constellations here, you open up CP points, this will automatically pop up. Hit Combat Metrics Import and it'll basically pull all the relevant information. You do need to manually input your spell penetration, so you're going to have to figure that out for your specific group. Swap over to the Champion Points tab, hit Calculate, and in this column here under New, it'll tell you which is the best optimal CP point distribution given your parse. So this is kind of how I've come around with this particular setup here. I have 39 to Spell Erosion, 52 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 16 into Staff Expert, 56 into Master at Arms, and 28 into Thaumaturge. And finally, for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most scenario. That's just because I like to take a more balanced approach, but you can rearrange your CPs depending on the content you're running. For example, if you're doing VMAW where you're taking a lot of spell damage, you're not going to necessarily need as many points into Hardy. So you can take points out of Hardy, put them into Elemental Defender or Ironclad or Spell Shield, so you do have some flexibility here. I have 48 into Ironclad, 48 in Thick Skin, 1 in Light Armor Focus, 56 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 31 into Bastion. You can take points out of Bastion and put them elsewhere if you'd like. However, I like to keep 31 points for the added damage shields, but also for these 2 passives. Field Physician, which reduces the damage you take while you're resurrecting somebody, which is very nice to have, and Infusion, which basically when you res somebody, it gives them a nice Magicka regen boost, which is really helpful when you're resing your Magicka DPS or your healers. That helps them get them back onto their feet, so they don't have to heavy attack as often right after you res them. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about our rotation. I'm going to re-up my Witchmothers real quick. So head over to this 3 million dummy so I can show you guys what is going on. So your back bar dots, your Liquid Lightning, and your Blockade are going to be your 2 strongest contributors to your DPS. Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration, Blockade has an 8-second duration, so you're going to want to put down Liquid Lightning first and then Blockade, like so. Take a look here at our buff tracker using Strendar. We can see that they both run out at about the same time. So if we do Blockade first and then Liquid Lightning like that, Blockade will expire before Liquid Lightning is up, which ends us, so when we recast our dots, we're actually going to end up overcasting Liquid Lightning. Basically, we're going to cast it before the duration runs out, which ends up wasting Magicka, as well as kind of a DPS loss there too, because you're not taking full advantage of the full duration of the dot. And then for our front bar, Haunting Curse has 2 hits, one at 3.5 seconds and a second after 8.5 seconds. So you can think of it as a 12-second dot. So it doesn't line up very nicely with Liquid Lightning or Blockade. So Mag Sorcs do have a dynamic rotation, so you will need to use, I recommend using a buff or debuff tracker, either the one that's built into the game itself, or using something like Strendal or Action Duration Reminder to keep track of Haunting Curse. So basically what you're going to want to do for your rotation is you want to start off obviously with your buffs and use your ultimates. Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Curse, and then you can start using your spammable. When Crystal Frags procs, make sure to use it right away, so that way you can open up for a second proc. And then that's basically what you want to do, and then you just want to keep track of your Haunting Curse using something like Strenda or Action Duration Reminder. So you can see here, I had a Crystal Frag proc when I was supposed to re-up my dots. So you can kind of take 2 approaches here. Some people like to get the Crystal Frag procs off and then swap to your back bar to do your dots. Other people, this is something that I like to do. I prefer to keep my dots up so I have 100% uptime on, or close to 100% uptime on my dots. And then when I swap back to my front bar, then use the Crystal Frags procs. But you can use either or, it doesn't really matter which one you pick. It's kind of a personal preference thing. Now for ultimates, you can have 2 options here. You can either go with the Storm Atronach or the Destro Staff ulti. The Storm Atronach will do a little bit better single target DPS, as well as, you know, provide an extra synergy for the tank and your DPS friends. But if you are against a boss that has adds, for example, against a mage in Ethereal Archive, then you do want to use the Destro Staff ulti instead, because it just covers a greater area than Storm Atronach. Storm Atronach only attacks 1 enemy at a time, and it's typically whichever one that you are also attacking. So it's very good for single target, but it's really, really bad for AoEs. So if you do need the AoE damage, then stick with the Destro Staff ulti. So let's go ahead and get started with our 6 million dummy parse. I will try to narrate throughout the parse so you guys can get an idea of what's going on in my head while we're doing our rotation. One thing that I do want you guys to keep in mind here is that we do have our native source of off balance. So with the changes in Dragon Bones, when you heavy attack with an enemy that's currently off balance, you get 2 times as many resources back compared to a heavy attack on a non-off balance enemy. So we are gonna have slightly better sustain compared to, for example, a double Inferno Staff Mag Sorc build. So that's something that you're gonna want to keep in mind. The better sustain will translate to better DPS overall. So let's go ahead and get started. So I like to heavy attack every other blockade, so every 2 blockade casts I will heavy attack. I like to use 3 blockades before my first heavy attack on a parse though. So this is where I'll use my first heavy attack. And then from here on out I'm going to go every other blockade. So this is blockade 1. This is blockade 2, and this is where I would heavy attack. And heavy attack here. Here's your ultimate. So one thing to keep in mind with the Storm Atronach ultimate is that it is fairly large, and it does count as a pet. So it does have collision. So that's something you want to keep in mind there. So you don't want to put it too close to your melee stack, but at the same time you also don't want it to be too far away either. And because it does count as a pet, I do believe it spreads Chain Lightning against the mage in Ethereal Archive, as well as any other mechanics that affects pets. However, I haven't really tested it out all the mechanics yet, so I cannot say for certainty what it is affected by and what it isn't. But it is something to keep in mind. So we can see here with the extra boost to resource return with off balance, our sustain isn't completely terrible. But we'll do a heavy attack before we enter execute. I just like going into execute with a healthy amount of magicka. Again, I will continue to heavy attack every other blockade. Alright, so there we go. That is our parse there. So we pulled 33.4k here with double lightning. So Storm Atronach again does decent amount of DPS here. It's pretty comparable to Shooting Star. You can kind of pick and choose whichever one you like. The main attraction of the Storm Atronach is the major Berserk synergy, which does help out somebody else's DPS, so that is something to keep in mind when you're taking a look at choosing whether you want to use Shooting Star or the Storm Atronach. Plus, if you do use the Storm Atronach, you don't have to grind out lore books, at least you don't have to grind out a lot of lore books in order to get Mage's Guild 10. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind here. So like I said earlier, Liquid Lightning and Blockade are going to be your top two contributors here. Crystal Frag procs, depending on how many procs you get, will kind of depend on where it falls in the whole DPS lineup. And we can see here Zaan is very powerful, pulling 2.2k DPS alone. So that's pretty strong. But again, you can only use this within melee range. So if you are at range, you will have to use Ilambris or Skoria instead. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.